Welcome back. Today on The Thinking Mind, we're talking all about ambition. Do you have control over your ambition? Or does your ambition have control over you? What does it mean to have healthier or less healthy forms of ambition? Can you be ambitious from a place of good self-esteem? What's the difference between self-esteem and narcissism? What does it mean to be an overachiever? These are the kinds of concepts we're going to be unpacking today. And joining me in this conversation is Stefan Stern. Stefan is a writer and journalist. He's been writing about management and leadership for over 2 decades. He has worked for the BBC, Management Today magazine, and the FT. He continues to write for the FT, The Guardian, and other publications. He is visiting professor in management practice at Bayes Business School, City University, and he was previously the director of the High Pay Centre, a think tank which focuses on the causes and consequences of economic inequality. Stefan is the author of How to Be a Better Leader, the co-author of Myths of Management, and most recently has written Fair or Foul, the Lady Macbeth Guide to Ambition. This is The Thinking Mind, a podcast all about psychiatry, psychotherapy, self-development, and related topics. If you'd like to support the podcast, do check out the links in the description. As I've mentioned in previous podcasts, I'm now offering one-on-one behavior change coaching sessions online. And these sessions are designed to help anyone work towards their goals, whether that's improving their health, improving the quality of their relationships, career design, kicking a bad habit, or perhaps getting into a healthier habit. I would be working with you in a highly individualized way, coming up with a plan to help you move towards your goals as fast as possible. So if that's something you're interested in, you can check out the details in the description. Thank you very much for listening. And now here's today's conversation with Stefan Stern. Stefan, welcome to the podcast.
Alex, thank you very much for having me.
What motivated you to write a book all about ambition?
I think it's a topic that's interested me most of my working life, even most of my adult life. It's been bubbling away, not always at the front of my mind, perhaps, but something I've been thinking about, in fact, ever since I first read Shakespeare's Macbeth, which was one of my A-level set texts over 40 years ago. And I think so at some level, I've been thinking about ambition ever since. It seems to me we have these choices in life. Often we have crossroads, trade-offs, whatever you want to call it. And whether we're conscious about it or not, we're wrestling with personal ambition, how we see the world, what matters to us. So I hope it's a topic that's of interest to everyone. It's certainly something that I think about a lot.
And I'm curious, did you have a particular reader in mind? I certainly felt like it resonated with me. I've thought a lot about ambition. I've had times in my life where I've been more or less ambitious and struggled to find how I should relate to my own ambitions. Did you have a particular reader in mind when writing this book?
It would be better if I could say yes, wouldn't it? But I think I was thinking more of the general reader. I think you're much younger than me, but I'm glad that you find it interesting. I did worry that it was, perhaps a rather middle-aged book. I'm a middle-aged guy, and I've reached a certain stage in life where you look back as much as you look forward. And so I wondered if part of my writing, it was actually a sort of self-assessment. I mean, selfishly, as you know, writing anything at length is difficult. It's a lot of work. You've really got to want to do it. So selfishly, I think I was answering questions for me. I was asking of my own life, have I made the right decisions? Have I been ambitious enough? Have I been too pushy, abrasive at other times? Am I getting things right? And what do I think about as I enter, what will be the third of my life, perhaps we could say, or the third quarter of 4, perhaps now it's more fashionable to say. So I didn't have a specific reader in mind, but I'm glad that you found it interesting.
Yeah, I guess I'm probably somewhat in the more ambitious stages of my life. But as I said before, I've definitely had different phases. And I think something we don't talk about enough is there's always a trade-off involved. People have their own sort of set values, I think, around ambition quite naturally by default. We know from studies of personality, some people are naturally more ambitious than others. but they don't necessarily, whatever end of the spectrum you find yourself on, there doesn't seem to be a lot of self-examination on what it's all for, whether that's the ambition or the lack of ambition. What is the ambition? What am I trying to achieve with this? Similarly, the lack of ambition, there isn't enough like reflection on why we might value what we value and where we're going from a big picture perspective. And what I got from your book is quite a careful examination. You did, I think we're quite similar in the sense when I'm writing, I hesitate to take a side. And I sensed your hesitation to take a side. I really sensed your desire to come across in a very well-balanced way.
Well, that's good. Again, cynically, commercially, it might have been cleverer to have been far more outspoken in one direction or the other, either really, really against ambition or really, really for it. But I couldn't quite do that. As you mentioned, I've worked at the BBC. I was at the FT for several years. I still write for them. And journalistically, when you've had that sort of background and training, you know that you've got to be a bit more measured and a bit more careful. Another reviewer said that he sensed ambivalence from the author about the topic of ambition. And I thought that was a rather astute comment too, because I don't know what you thought. It strikes me that this is quite a British, perhaps, or European take on ambition. It's not an American take. If I was crudely, stereotyping the American sort of gung-ho spirit, this is more measured. I couldn't write a book that was purely negative about ambition. Of course, we need ambitions and ambitious people. But what I was trying to say also is that, we can be ambitious for, the greater good, the common good, not just for ourselves. And that, and the Macbeth theme is interesting because there's someone who was very talented, was very able, esteemed person in society, but nonetheless, it was not quite enough. And he aims, I'm going to spoil it for anyone who doesn't know Macbeth, but he aims too far and things go wrong.
Why did Macbeth go wrong? Like how... Given that he had so many things in favor, how and why did he make those choices that he made?
It's a wonderful question, and because it's a timeless classic, this play, and that's why people come back to it and why it's staged every year. One critic said of Shakespeare, he wrote a book called Shakespeare, Our Contemporary. And in your field, people, I don't know what your view of Sigmund Freud is, but he was fascinated by Shakespeare, and I think Ernest Jones psychoanalyzed Hamlet, I think, at one point. So Shakespeare, although not trained in your disciplines, nonetheless had I think a fascination with the psyche and human personality. Macbeth, well, he knows what he's doing is wrong. I mean, this is why it's a tragedy. As you say, he's an esteemed figure in society. He's very successful, admired, very close to the king, but he isn't the king. And the king has named his son as his successor. But he's met these witches. He has this, we can speculate what that is. It's a metaphysical or a supernatural or a psychological, perhaps he's imagined the whole thing, who knows, moment. But they tell him that he will be king. Now, is that a prophecy? Is it an instruction? Is it guidance? Is it what we might call, what the Americans would call a bum steer? Is it just a bad bit of advice that he follows? Anyway, for whatever reason, he weighs it up. He has the opportunity. But in Act 1, Scene 7, he has decided not to go through with the murder of the king until his wife comes along and they have a marital discussion, and he changes his mind. And it's partly why, it was partly a joke, but it's partly why I've called the book The Lady Macbeth Guide to Ambition, because she is absolutely instrumental. And the play, apart from anything else, as a study of a marriage, is absolutely fascinating, and why people are motivated to do what they do, and how they try to keep their relationships, together on the road. And partly he does it. I can't blame her alone, but partly he goes through with this murderous plot because he has discussed it with his wife, and they together have agreed to do it. And he doesn't want to let her down. That's in the script. That's partly there.
It's got interesting echoes of Adam and Eve.
Yes, absolutely.
Eve tempting Adam with the... I don't know if this... I'm not a literary expert. I don't know if these parallels have been drawn before.
Well, I haven't thought of that one myself, but of course you're absolutely right. That's the ultimate, certainly in the Jewish and Christian traditions, that's the ultimate story of, and some would say now somewhat misogynist account of a woman being blamed for the fall of man in Genesis, in the Hebrew Bible. The woman beguiled me and I did eat, is what Adam says to God in his defense. And I think you're absolutely right. When there's a husband and wife scene, whether it's this play, whether it's the Bible, whether it's that famous Edward Albee play, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, made in a film with Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, with a husband and wife, whether it's Beatrice and Benedict, more comically, in Much Ado About Nothing. Husband and wives are private lives, Noel Coward. It's always a classic dilemma, classic tension. But yes, there is a hint of, in this play, in Macbeth, there's a hint of Lady Macbeth persuading him finally to go through with something that he was wavering about.
There's a really interesting interpretation of the Adam and Eve story through an evolutionary psychology lens that actually it's not really a following of the fall of man exactly, but it's more humanity gaining consciousness for the first time, and all of the pros and cons of gaining consciousness. And in the story, obviously, the cons are awareness of the need to work. From now on, you're going to toil, because if you're conscious, you can become aware of the future, and awareness of snakes and awareness of predators. And through that lens, it's really interesting because, eating the fruit from the tree of knowledge isn't exactly a bad thing. It's more like, okay, humanity is gaining some awareness.
Yes.
And in that respect, I think, women are the half of the species which help men gain some useful awareness about, what needs to be done in this life. So in that respect, I think women can be really useful to men because they help us understand what's important. And I think, obviously, women are also the deciders of which genes get to go to the next generation and which men measure up,
And in the division of labour in reproduction, of course, the male contribution is momentary and instantaneous, as it were, and the female gestation period is, in humans anyway, far, far longer. And then after birth as well, the mother, traditionally perhaps is taking a far greater the burden of work forward. So yes, Goethe said that the eternal feminine draws us on through life. So the great writers have spotted, male or female, the great writers have spotted that the feminine drive is incredibly important, and perhaps more important sometimes than the male one.
So getting back to ambition, how do you think we should start to examine and reflect on our ambitions and to what extent they're leading us down healthier or less healthy directions?
Well, I've written a bit about this, and I'm very happy to get some feedback from you and guidance from you, because you're more expert in these science questions than I am. But it seems to me that ambition is a kind of personal response to the world, and that's obviously informed by early experiences, childhood experiences, relations with parents, the circumstances you're born into. It is sometimes said that entrepreneurs who are very ambitious commercially are often driven by some early difficulties, perhaps a bad relationship with a parent, perhaps starting out very poor in life, perhaps as a uprooted person, as an immigrant, and so on. And this seems to drive people on to achieve more, to prove a point. So that's one kind of ambition. But of course, there is perhaps, as you hinting, a less intense or dramatic ambition, and perhaps more sustainable, perhaps a healthier ambition, just to be content, to do good work, to make a good contribution to society. These two are ambitions. So I think ambition takes many different forms and levels of intensity. Some people will never be satisfied. We look at Rupert Murdoch, for example, who I think is now 94 years old and still apparently essentially in control of his business. And just recently, just before we recorded this, Warren Buffett has finally announced that he is stepping down from his big financial group, Berkshire Hathaway, and he's 94, 95, but he's kept going until now. Some people feel the need to carry on and somehow can never be satisfied for whatever reason. And this is where, psychiatry and psychotherapy could probably be very useful. Not that I suspect Mr. Murdoch would ever submit to an investigation of that kind.
Yeah, I mean, definitely aside from the facts that you mentioned, I would also think about genetics. You know, we know from studies of personality and behavioral genetics that on average, personality traits are 50% heritable, meaning 50% of the differences can be explained by genetic rather than environmental influences. I've talked about this before on the podcast. If people are interested, they can read a book called Blueprint by Robert Plomin, which is all about this. I think, you know, obviously genetics are something that, you know, they can change, you know, across life. We're starting to learn about epigenetics. But I think all the really interesting stuff does happen psychologically. And if I'm talking to someone about choices, you know, I'm always interested where they feel the motivation coming from for them. If someone loves working hard, like really loves working hard, and they're doing it because it fills them with a kind of present moment joy, then so be it, you know. But you always wonder about the people for whom ambition and hard work is coming from a place of not enoughness, insecurity, self-criticism. Actually, one of the reasons I really want to talk to you was about the archetype of the insecure overachiever.
Oh yes,
You know, which I think is such a tragedy, and so much of our economy is built on insecure overachievers. Maybe you could unpack this a bit for our listeners. Like, what does it mean to be an insecure overachiever?
Well, it's a fascinating label, and it's quite the clarifying label. Excuse me, I think, because when you think about some of the most competitive industries in finance, politics, but also in sport, the people who are driven, and as you say, nothing is ever quite good enough. And even after a triumph, the thoughts turn to the next challenge and the next one. It's a strange combination of being self-critical. I mean, there's another phrase that is used quite widely and perhaps loosely of imposter syndrome, so-called. This idea that I am not good enough, I am a phony, I'm not for real, a voice, an insecurity somehow in your head saying, oh, come off it, who are you trying to fool? You're not as impressive as you pretending to be. But the insecure achievers seem to be driven by a bit of fear of either being found out or of failing their own very high standards, or perhaps some other person's high standards, perhaps an unnamed other person, perhaps an arbitrary, almost mythological figure. But it could be a disapproving parent, classically, but it might be something else. It might be a school teacher who told you that you were nothing, you know, when you were young, and that you were never going to amount to anything. And that can drive people on. And so there's that desire not merely to achieve, to succeed, but to overachieve, to be outstanding in the literal sense, to be a remarkable success. But even then, perhaps there is an inability to take a deep breath, have some perspective, to be objective about your achievements and say, this is something to be content about, and I can happily retire or ease up or redirect my energies towards something else. I think the insecure overachiever finds it very hard to be happy in that sense. And of course, the clue is in the adjective, and you know, the first word of the two, insecure. These are about insecurities. It's not about being well adjusted. It's about having uncertainty, discomfort, being ill at ease, not comfortable in your own skin. All these phrases that we use. And these are personality types, I think, or traits. I mean, so I'm going to use some of the language a bit loosely, Alex, not like a professional person like you.
No pressure.
But these are, these are characteristics of people, and we sense it very quickly. I think as we get older, I mean, there's a danger of something called pattern recognition, isn't there, in psychology, where you can sometimes believe you're in a similar situation, or you believe you're with someone that, oh, I know this type of person, I've worked with someone like him before. And that can lead you astray. But some of our instincts are very good. And we spot it quite quickly. In the workplace, we spot difficult bosses, I think, very quickly when we've had one or two before. And we think, he's never going to be happy. You know, I can feel that already. I can recognize that after a few months working with this guy. Nothing's going to be good enough. And that, you know, and that's when we have to take these decisions about our career paths and our ambition. Can I put up with this for another year or two on the basis that if I get through the next year or two, there might be a better job on the other side of it, or there might be a different boss in due course? Or do I actually lack the resilience, Do I lack the sort of toughness to put up with a really difficult boss? And would I be happier going somewhere else? I mean, these are also aspects of ambition, I think, because they're about personal career choices. But yes, insecure overachiever. I'm diagnosing myself not as being not an insecure overachiever. My late mother was a child psychologist, educational psychologist, and also a very lovely Jewish mother. So I had a lot of advantages, I think, starting out, but also I was encouraged and not made to feel insecure. I was made to feel extremely secure, I'm happy to tell you and your listeners. So I think some of that insecurity certainly can start very young, and I was not exposed to that, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the whole insecure overachiever, I tend to frame it as a self-esteem issue fundamentally.
Yep.
And I wrote a whole essay about this, which I put on my podcast about a year ago, Insecure Overachievers and the Dallas Cowboy Cheerleaders. I don't know if you watched the documentary about the Dallas Cowboy Cheerleaders, but they seem to conform to that archetype. And I am really curious as to your thoughts. Do you think that organizations, big companies, prestigious companies, consciously or unconsciously take advantage of that? Because that seems to be what I've seen, where the way corporations and some companies are structured, it's almost to exploit this archetype. Is this something you've seen?
I think there has been something of that, perhaps in the investment banking world, perhaps in the elite law firms, management consultancies. I think you've spoken to my good colleague and friend, Laura Empson, who's a professor at what we used to call Cass Business School. We now call ourselves Bayes Business School. But she's really an expert in the professional service firms, and has certainly spotted, I think, that as first in the recruitment and then through the career. You see this in the sort of elite financial houses too. This pressure, real and imagined, explicit and implicit, to do well and to do really well and to compete and to prove yourself. Yeah, I mean, they benefit from applicants that, and what in the horrible management language we call the pipeline of human beings. This future the pipeline of people who turn up applying from elite universities and so on, needing to do well, needing to prove themselves to their peers and to others. And yes, I think quite a lot of that is perhaps based on being an insecure overachiever, and that the organizations themselves knowingly exploit those vulnerabilities. And that's why there still doesn't seem to be too much of a shortage, for all that we talk about the generations changing their attitudes to work and so on, and the younger people coming through. I think there's still not a shortage of candidates for some of these hard-driven elite firms and so on.
And just so people can get a really clear idea, because they may be working in these companies, they may have these jobs without being aware that they're being exploited. How might a company subtly or not so subtly exploit someone with these kinds of issues?
Oh, well, I think you play on the insecurity bit, don't you? And you let it be known that you've got, and again, this is where there's a gradation of behavior, because it could be very good management and leadership to have high expectations. It could be very good to tell people you're capable of great things and we want to support you in that and we want to help you achieve that. And I think Adam Grant at Wharton has written about this, that high expectations could be a very healthy and a very positive thing. But if you twist it and go over the top with that, and use it to exploit people's insecurity, then I think you're doing something darker, more troubling, more exploitative. And this business of comparing people, something that we do individually, we compare ourselves to others, that can often be a route to unhappiness, especially if we have unrealistic comparisons with elite performers. But similarly, what a manager could do improperly is encourage people to be very competitive between themselves in a bad way. Again, there's a gradation, there's a spectrum of behavior. People talk about something called tournament theory within the organization, which could be quite a healthy thing. This idea that there should be competition to get to the top. We do want ambitious people to want to take on these bigger, tougher jobs nearer the top of the organization with bigger responsibilities and bigger salaries, of course. But yeah, big responsibilities. And we shouldn't belittle or sneer at people who want to get to the top. That's is completely healthy. It depends how you do it, and it depends with what you do with that power once you have acquired it and attained it. So this is, the difference between, crudely, good leadership and bad leadership. Good leaders will support people, bring them on, think about the organization, not just themselves. Bad leaders will be more selfish, less interested in the organization, satisfying narrow personal ambition, perhaps at the expense of their employees and the business they're running.
Yeah. I see the tragedy of the insecure overachiever as really because these are some of the most high-performing, smartest, hardworking people we have in our society. And the tragedy is it's like having a really powerful engine, but they're not sitting at the steering wheel, or someone else is sitting at the steering wheel for them, almost using them in some sense. And there's this really interesting psychologist named Carl Rogers, who was essentially the founder of something called person-centered therapy. And he had this idea of conditions of worth that we all carry around, conscious and unconscious conditions, which if we meet them, we allow ourselves to feel worthy. And Rogers would say that a lot of people, having never reflected on it, will carry a lot of external conditions of worth, prestige, what other people think of them, status, and so on. And obviously, there needs to be a balance. It's not like you can live a life not really thinking about the external world at all. But if someone is just carrying external conditions of worth and they've never cultivated an internal range of conditions, what are my own values? What do I own? What do I think is important? You live a very untethered life in some sense. You're like flying without a radar, or again, like driving without a steering wheel, and other people can hijack you and hijack your orientation in that way.
And yes, and also when you sense in others a kind of almost aimless ambition, that I think that relates to that. When people seem to be very driven, but they're not quite sure why, and also they can't ever be happy because actually they are sort of deracinated in that sense. It is a kind of ungrounded ambition. Another thing I think we see in workplaces and organizations is that clash between those who do have some of that comfort, some of that sense of self-worth. Whether they deserve it or not is perhaps a separate question, but they have a slightly less fraught or intense demeanor precisely because they have a certain level of comfort. And that, of course, is also potentially very provocative to a boss who is not so comfortable and who is still insecure and absolutely driven. And that's a kind of personality clash, a clash of emphasis, clash of priorities. When you're being managed by someone, and you have to sometimes at least give the impression of being just as intense and committed as they are, because if they sense an element of comfort, which they might regard as nonchalance or complacency or being lackadaisical, that's very provocative to a driven, intense boss, and they often only want similarly driven people around them. So you have to acquire the ability to at least give the impression of being as driven as your very driven boss if you want a more quiet life.
Absolutely. That reminds me of narcissism. If you're in a relationship, friendship, romantic relationship, work relationship with a narcissist, what you learn quite quickly is they want you to mirror them. And that the psychological theory would be they unconsciously fail to separate between themselves and others, and therefore would like to see others as a reflection of themselves.
Yes, it's it.
So if you're in an involuntary relationship with a narcissist, your let's say at a work situation, your best bet is to make sure, at least by all appearances, you're mirroring them so they don't see you as a threat. Because as soon as you stop mirroring, they're going to see you as like an obstacle that needs to be destroyed if they're that malignant a narcissist.
I think that's absolutely right. And I'm going to misquote him now, but Gian Piero Petrinelli from INSEAD used a phrase like this recently when he said, the narcissist loves himself or herself, but just in your presence. They are so delighted by themselves, they're almost obsessed with themselves. And you just have to, as you say, you just have to kind of go with the ride, as it were, and not do anything to disturb that too much, because they won't necessarily be able to cope with it anyway. This is what I think. This is why these questions are so fascinating, because they are subtle, they are timeless. Wherever human beings meet and interact, these tensions can rise, and when the stakes are high, so much more so. And I suppose this is partly why we find the political struggle, or intense sporting rivalries, or intense commercial rivalries fascinating and dramatic, because we feel that there are strong, big personalities at play with powerful feelings being expressed and displayed forcefully, and that makes for drama.
To what extent do you think narcissism is a prerequisite to success and leadership? There's a lot of different thoughts on this. Some people think, you have to be a bit delusionally self-confident. Can you get by with healthy self-esteem? Is healthy self-esteem enough to be successful in conventional terms in this life, do you think?
That's a wonderful and very subversive question. My friend who died sadly recently, a couple of years ago, Michael Maccabee, you may have read, he wrote about something called constructive narcissism, and he made a very sort of subtle and intelligent defense of the role of narcissism in someone like, he was talking about Barack Obama, for example, and Bill Clinton, and we've got political figures are the ones we often know about. And then even in that drama that was very popular, The West Wing, one of the characters, Toby Ziegler, who's a sort of rather uncomfortable, driven policy guru and thinker, really. And he says, you'd better be, if you think you're going to be president of the United States, you'd better be narcissistic. You'd better have a pretty high opinion of yourself. You better think you're special. You can't be sheepish. You can't be entirely well-adjusted in that sense. We don't really want utterly modest, self-deprecating, quiet people at the top, because we kind of want to look up to them a bit, and they're going to have to compete. However, how much above us do we want them to be? We want them to be still relatable in the modern world. We want them to be familiar. And there was a professor at California, Jay Conger, who told me years ago, he says, we want leaders to be a bit taller than us, but not too much taller. So we don't want they want to be remote. But yeah, so I think narcissism, I think Michael Maccabee was right. I think that, there must be a role for some sort of constructive, healthy narcissism, particularly at a time when the challenges are very great, like today, like in 2025. Again, these are not challenges we can be too sheepish or mealy-mouthed about as leaders. We're going to need leaders who can see the big picture and the challenges, but then somehow make them understandable and manageable when they talk about them, when they describe them to us. So yes, we have very high expectations of leaders. We want them to be these very rounded, sophisticated people, but we've got to tolerate a bit of narcissism, I think, sometimes. It's not necessarily a purely negative phenomenon.
Yes, psychoanalytically, you could say some people like to disown their ability to have agency and power in the world, and therefore they project a lot. They feel more comfortable projecting power into other people. And so when someone's narcissistic, they're very ready to receive that projection. They're very ready to be like, yeah, absolutely, I'm going to take care of everything. And as much as we worship freedom explicitly, consciously in the West, I think in the West we're always talking about, we want to be free to do whatever we want to do at any time. Whenever we really worship something explicitly, you can be certain that implicitly we crave the opposite. We crave, I think, being taken care of, not having to make every decision, having someone at the top that can kind of shepherd us through the crisis. So I think we can end up in a very strange relationship with the ruling or political class, and they can take on the burdens maybe that we don't want to take on.
Yes, indeed. And we remember, perhaps now nostalgically and fondly, remember Bill Clinton, who was famously the empathetic leader, and the cliche phrase was, I feel your pain. I'm not sure if he ever actually used that phrase verbatim, but that was the message he was sending. I feel your pain. I recognize, I understand what you're going through, and I feel it too, and I share it, and I'm like you. I'm not so remote from you. I'm a human being. What we have today, we don't want to get hijacked by Trump, like all conversations are at the moment. But this is something far more bizarre, I think. I mean, this is not a healthy narcissism. And this is also, I mean, I think we teeter over into something like sadism. And I can't say if we can even call it being a sociopath, but Trump makes a pitch to his core supporters and they seem to enjoy it. But equally, absolutely part of his business is to be coarse and unpleasant and threatening and offensive and insulting to the people who don't support him. And rather than being a unifying leader, he's absolutely, apparently trying to divide. I mean, that's part of his way of operating. But clearly, there's something, I think, even beyond narcissism. I know after Barry Goldwater, American psychologists and so on agreed that they shouldn't do what I'm doing now, amateur, ill-informed, semi-informed psychoanalysis of peak public figures who were not their patient. And that used to be a professional convention. But I think in the case of Trump, that has been relaxed a bit because Trump is such an extreme example of a really rather bizarre personality, it seems to me, that it is irresistible to speculate on what has shaped him. And this is something beyond mere narcissism. I think this is something really very odd indeed.
Yeah, I agree. And I'll wade in and do my own semi-informed psychoanalysis. I think one pattern you can see is on the political left, without making any statements, about who's right, political left or political right, I think they both have merits in different ways. I think what you've seen on the political left in America for a long time is incongruence, by which I mean say one thing, do something different, kind of presenting a very professional, calm facade, and then quietly things are going on in the background which people aren't so happy with, to an extreme. And I think what you see, and I think that partly encouraged the rise of an extremely, to a fault, congruent figure like Trump. And I think what people kind of envy about Trump in some strange way is that he always seems 100% certain about what he says, and he's willing to say whatever crude or vulgar or offensive thing that's on his mind. And that's how you know he is being congruent, because the things he says are so vulgar and crude and offensive and so on brand. It all fits. It all makes sense. Everything that he says makes sense in light of everything we know about his personality. If Barack Obama said the exact same things he said, he would get in trouble because that would be so incongruent with Barack Obama's brand, which is the measured, calm political figure. So I think Trump, in some way, is this like release valve for all the people who feel they have a lot of things that are very dark and offensive and aggressive that they want to say, and they don't feel like they can say them, for better or worse,
That rings very true. I think that's a very plausible description. And of course, you didn't use the fashionable word that's become a cliche, which is, authenticity, authentic. But people would say about Trump, well, he's, we get the feeling that in public, he's giving us the real Donald Trump. We get the feeling that maybe in private, he's not so different. I think he probably is a little bit more sophisticated in private than he appears in public, but maybe not so much. He certainly convincingly seems to be, as we say, shooting from the hip and giving space to some pretty basic prejudices, basic views, and he doesn't mind about old-fashioned concepts such as manners or civility, courtesy, or the things that we used to actually think American presidents would display, at least in public. He's changing it. We don't want to, as I say, don't want to get too hijacked by Trump, but one of the other reasons I think he's so destabilizing psychologically for us all collectively is this kind of norm busting. He's upended many of the conventions of public life, of behavior, of political leadership in democracies that we had come to expect ever since 1945, and it's quite a shattering moment in a way, certainly destabilizing moment for many people, but that's another conversation maybe.
Yeah, and it's the extremes are always going to be dysfunctional. You don't want to be always congruent. You don't want to always be extremely incongruent. I think the political left has a tendency towards some level of incongruence, because I think if you're left-leaning, you tend to value things like politeness a little bit more. if you're right-leaning, you tend to be a little bit more congruent, because right-leaning people tend to be a little bit more disagreeable, a little less compassionate, for better or for worse. But it's where you go out to the extremes that's a problem. It's kind of similar to ambition, Ambition is a tool that can help you accomplish things. But the problem is, and a lot of what you really wrote about quite nicely in your book, is how, a lot of people, ambition isn't the tool that they use, but ambition uses them. They become like a victim of their own ambition in a way.
Yes, exactly. Yes. That's right. Are you actually, yes, the victim of your own ambition rather than someone deploying it in a considered way? Has it consumed you? Certainly with Lady Macbeth, that's what it feels like. This famous speech where she asks, and it's quite topical as well, she asks for her femininity to be removed, not in the contemporary sense of transgender, not because she says she wants to be a man, but she does say she wants to be less female. She calls on the gods and the dark spirits. She says, unsex me here, unsex me. It's an invented verb. It's, again, part of Shakespeare's linguistic and poetic genius that he can think of a verb like that. Unsex me here and fill me from the crown to the toe, top full of direst cruelty, she said. But she thinks that to carry out this evil act of regicide, of killing the king, who was a guest in their own castle that evening with her husband, she has to be less feminine about things, less female. And it's a fascinating, again, you could say amateur, but it's a fascinating psychological insight. And in her collapse, and indeed Sigmund Freud did write a short paper about Lady Macbeth, but in her collapse later on, we sort of see, as it were, a reappearance of the suppressed femininity. I think that's how I read it, the sleepwalking scene. And so again, all these aspects are in this play.
And do we ever understand Lady Macbeth's motivations? Why was she so focused on Macbeth's ascension through killing the king? Do we ever find out about that?
Not really. And one of the problems of Macbeth as a script, as a text, it's much shorter than some of the other great tragedies like Hamlet or King Lear or Antony Cleopatra, Othello. It's much shorter. And so there's been speculation among the literary scholars that perhaps some scenes are missing. Perhaps it's not the complete text, although why there would be scenes missing, whereas none of the other major plays have got scenes missing from the first folio that was published in the 1620s, 400 years ago. She says, I mean, one of the debates about Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are, did they have any children? They don't seem to have children. And yet, she, again, in this important scene where she persuades him to go through with the murder, she talks about breastfeeding a baby. I have given suck, she says. I have given suck and know how tender 'tis to love the babe that milks me. So, have they had a baby before that died in childhood? Was she married before? I mean, none of these things are explained. But she is, anyway, in a sense, even more intensely ambitious than him and driven even more than him. We don't quite know why, but she seems less healthy even than him. And indeed, it is her psychology, her mental health, which collapses first, not his. Hence the sleepwalking, and hence the loss of sanity, and the implication that perhaps she actually takes her own life. Again, that's not made quite clear how she dies. She dies off stage, but she becomes truly ill and collapses.
And again, there's the really interesting theme that any personality trait taken to its extreme goes down a self-destructive path.
Yes, was it Hogan who talks about overstrengths? I mean, sometimes, and in business we have a leader who does very well, or a politician does very well, and perhaps they become a little bit stereotyped. Again, this business of pattern recognition, where they go, yes, I recognize this situation, and last time what I did was this, and that played to my strength, and everything worked out well. But yes, you can sort of overemphasize what might have been a strength and become almost caricatured as a certain type of person, and lack the adaptability, lack the ability to adjust. We always say of leaders, whatever field, that they need this sort of repertoire of behavior to be good sensors of the situation, and sensors of the context that they're in, the moment. and the people they're working with. And again, the rigidity of personality probably doesn't help. You can be a very effective leader at certain times, a time of war, for example, conflict, or of intense competition. But perhaps an organization or a business needs something else in a different period, and then you need a different type of leader, or at least different types of behavior. But as you know, it's a big ask of anyone to be able to display very different types of behavior, especially when they're under pressure. That's actually very, very hard. And on the whole, politicians and business leaders fail when the circumstances change and they are not quite able to change with them and move with the times.
Yeah, I think one of the most mind-blowing things I learned about personality when I studied it is, we think about personality as an attitude and maybe a set of behaviors. But the most mind-blowing thing I learned is personality is also a perceptive thing. It's how you see the world. For example, if you are highly extroverted, you see the world as a landscape of social opportunities, of parties and conferences and places to meet people. If you're hardworking, you see the world as a job market. If you're an introvert, you see the world as a place to shy away from. So the crucial thing to understand is your brain is always selecting out most of the information you could perceive, unconsciously focusing on a tiny amount, in part dependent on the personality traits which predominate. So you might think your personality might make you inadequate to respond to a certain situation, and that's true, but it goes even further than that. Your personality will change what problems you even perceive in the first place. If you look at a newspaper with one personality, different articles are going to appear to you as relevant to other personalities. And that's why it's so important to have teams, teams of people with different personalities. I'm sure you've seen this in the business world. You need teams with different temperaments.
This is exactly right. And also, just to be parochial, the current UK political scene, the Prime Minister is a highly successful, very highly regarded lawyer, a barrister, advocate, who and we know that they take on a brief, they take on a commission, as it were, and argue a case, and then the case is settled and they move on. And that could be very useful in political leadership. But equally, as you've just described, we need people who have a wide perspective and a feel for different circumstances and the ability to recognize different circumstances and the need to behave differently. And you hope that such leaders are also, as you say, well served by a team of good advisors who are free to say what they honestly think, and what they honestly think will not get them into trouble or limit their career prospects. And there's another part of your point about perception. We need these personalities in leadership who are capable of hearing bad news and not blaming the messenger, not blaming the person who's delivering the bad news. We need realists, I think, is how I would characterize that. Realists, and perhaps even I could say pragmatists, people who can adapt and can deal with reality. There's a leadership guru, management guru called Jim Collins, and he talks about confronting the brutal fact of life
and remaining reality oriented.
Yes, reality oriented. That's right. Surrealist bosses who make unreasonable demands often achieve amazing things. Elon Musk is someone who, has crushed the production cycle time on space rockets or cars, partly by being completely unreasonable, by being almost a surrealist, by making ridiculous and absurd and possibly even harmful demands of some of his teams. But sometimes it's worked out, surprisingly well, and other times less so. But it's an old line. I think George Bernard Shaw, who said that, only unreasonable people change things because reasonable people, tolerate reality.
But it's like, I think, as you said, there's this balance between having an unreasonable goal with paired with a reality orientation. So I have an unreasonable goal, but I'm committed to reality orientation to get there. And I think what you see in a lot of career trajectories, even if you look at trajectories like someone like an Adolf Hitler, or you look at the trajectories of certain films like criminal gangster films, it's like unreasonable goal with reality orientation in the beginning, But as the person accrues success, often wild success, the unreasonable demand goes up, but reality orientation goes down. And all of a sudden you have the person thinking, oh, I'm going to achieve this goal because it's me. Like I'm the secret sauce. I'm the special ingredient. I think personally, I'm not a historian. Napoleon had this problem. Like there was a certain point, it seemed like Napoleon reached a point where he was like, I'm going to win because I'm Napoleon, not because I had really good strategy. And then that's where people seem to get into trouble. And then people become very, very unreality oriented. And then there's like a downfall.
Yes. Well, in the business world, the cliche is that success doesn't really teach you a lot. Failure teaches you a lot more, especially if you can learn from it and build on it. But success may very well just sort of reinforce your own initially slightly deluded sense of your abilities and just enhances that. And being reality-based, you mentioned criminals. I think famously, I can't remember which, there was the gang, the Cray brothers, Ronnie and Reggie Cray in the 60s. And I can't remember which brother it was who actually was finally caught for murder when he just killed someone, as we say, in cold blood in a pub. And I think probably you could say his grasp of reality had gone. He thought, I can get away with this. And worryingly, Trump, last time when he was campaigning, said, I could shoot someone in Fifth Avenue and it wouldn't cost me any support. My support would go up. And this is also the dark side of him and the murky, troubling side that he sort of flirts with some of this, but he's never been caught for anything serious. So we must presume that he's never done anything quite as serious as that.
One more thing I did want to ask you about in terms of ambition was, the UK has a very peculiar relationship to ambition. The UK used to be the dominant superpower in the world, and yet I've lived here for 10 years. There seems to be a bit of a sheepish attitude towards ambition. We mentioned ambivalence, and I don't think it's actually ambivalent, because I think an ambivalent attitude is quite a psychologically mature perspective, the ability to appreciate both the pros and the cons. That's the mature attitude I got from your book. But what I see in the UK is like a kind of a cynicism and a repression. And my question to you, and maybe you don't have an answer for this, is why, Stefan? Why? Especially in comparison to countries like the US, where they seem to run on ambition, again, for better or for worse. But what is it about the UK that gives us this relationship to ambition, do you think?
Well, it's a fascinating question and a big topic. Dean Acheson, who was Harry Truman's Secretary of State, said that after the war, Britain had lost an empire, but not yet found a role. And that was a serious and an intelligent thing to say, which I think a lot of Brits at the time probably found quite difficult to take and still do. And I think if you think of the Brexit discussions from almost 10 years ago now, some of that was about a kind of nostalgia, it seems to me, for a time when Britain was still a serious big player, global superpower, and even imperial. And we're speaking in the week of the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. And once again, Britain is, marking it with seriously big events and, even celebrations. But this is double-edged because, it's back, in a sense, it is backward looking inevitably. And I think there is, crudely, to oversimplify, there is a sort of unease about Britain's place in the world, and it's part of the Brexit debate. There is, post-imperial decline, not as severe a decline as we sometimes think. Britain is still a much richer country than it was 40, 50, 60 years ago, but, famously not necessarily doing as well as some of our continental European neighbours or some of the emerging countries of Asia. If we think about Monty Python, the comedy group, they had a sketch where in Whitehall, where government is located, they had a government department. It was called the Ministry of Silly Walks. And John Cleese and others were marching up and down Whitehall, walking in a silly way. And this was a satirical moment, but in a sense, it was sort of saying, well, we used to have empires and have the map painted red. And now who are we? What are we? And again, and clearly this is part of the British confusion, if you like, in its relationship to the rest of Europe. Who are we? Are we a kind of American offshoot, or are we actually really a European country? So I think Britain is still quite a confused place, and that relates to the ambition too. We're burdened by memories of greatness, And yet, and it gets very controversial. So when people try to reassess the British Empire and give a more measured account of it, some people get very upset. The hint that Britain might have benefited from, slavery or exploitation or colonialism, imperialism, that these might not have been good things, and that some of the wealth that we see and some of the great buildings we see around us in the UK may have actually been built on the back of slavery or exploited labor. Some people can get very upset when you start saying that to them. And so we still haven't quite come to terms with some of our wonderful, great, but also troubling history. And perhaps that's a slightly uncertain foundation on which to build healthy ambitions for the future. Or it explains why, the identity is confused and like many other countries, concerns about, the makeup of the population and so on. And who are we really? And all that. It's all in the mix. Whereas America is a new country. It's an experiment. It's still developing. And it was formed partly as an escape from old Europe and the old ways of doing things. And they can still be almost uncomplicatedly, healthily ambitious about the future because they're still writing their new history. And perhaps we struggle to do that a bit in the UK sometimes.
Yeah, again, I can see both sides of it in the UK. It's like on the political right, you see like a refusal to acknowledge some of the darker aspects of the UK's past. On the political left, you'd see a lack of willingness to acknowledge the good things about the UK's past. For example, that the UK was one of the first countries to abolish slavery and actually fought to abolish slavery among other states, which is, paradox is hard to deal with. And I think what distinguishes like self-esteem from narcissism is this desire to expunge any of your flaws and project a hyper unrealistic version of all your virtues. And I think self-esteem is the ability to be like, I have these strengths, I have these flaws, and I'm going to try my best. It's kind of something that's a much more quietly powerful, but still humble approach to oneself and one's life, I think. And maybe I'm not going to, steadfastly prescribe something for the country, but if I was pushed, it would be something like a kind of healthy self-esteem kind of thing that the UK could adopt, perhaps.
Very good, yeah. And reality-based, absolutely. Healthy self-esteem, I'm with you. I'm for that too.
Reality-based, definitely. We want to stay reality-based. Stefan, unfortunately, we're out of time, but it's been wonderful talking to you. Your book, Fair or Foul, The Lady Macbeth Guide to Ambition. If you're interested in learning more about ambition, I can't recommend this book enough. It's such a nice, well-balanced, comprehensive view on this topic. Stefan, where can people go to find out more about your work?
Well, they can certainly buy the book on that big online sales place called Amazon and order it from their local bookshops if they can't find it on the bookshelf. Some of my work's been published in The Guardian, which is freely available on the internet. If you're an FT subscriber, you can also see some of my pieces there. And you mentioned 2 other books that I've written. So Google me and there's a back catalogue to check out if you're really feeling bored.
Perfect. Stefan, thanks so much.
Thank you, Alex. It's great fun talking to you.